Okay, so we've reviewed pretty much the end-to-end processes now in their entirety. So we've covered a lot of information. I know it's probably a lot to take on. One thing I wanted to do before we close out this session is to take a look at the service connectors themselves. And hopefully now you've seen this end-to-end process, the service connectors will make a lot more sense. So if I go into this, let's look at the Edge API. So in the Edge API, which by the way, you get to these by just going new service connector. That's the same for all these different artifacts that I'm creating here. And in the Edge API, I just, in the definition section, I gave it a name here. And I've also said, what are the parameters that I want to be stored at a connection level? So these typically would be your service account credentials. Even if you're, perhaps doing impersonation calls to change roles based on who is interacting with the API, you may still have some service level account credentials that you want to have stored here. We do have the ability to actually encrypt those as well, or change the data type. And you'll also notice that we can declare that this connection, this service connector, should only ever be run at the agent level. Now this is very useful if you've got an internal API and you want to make sure that it's never called from the cloud. It's actually always called from the agent. Obviously, if you've got an internal API that is existing behind the firewall, there's no point trying to call it from the cloud server because you won't be able to get through to that endpoint. So in the actions section, this is really where the meat of the definition is. And we break this up into a series of different actions. And think of this in the same way as you would define methods in any API that you're defining. You're defining how end users should consume the service within their design environment. So remember when we were looking through this, if we did a service call, we'd be able to select from, for example, Edge, and then go under authentication and select login. Those actions are what we are seeing here in the service connector. So we've got an action name of login, an action type of general, and here in the action section, we can just change a few of these properties, such as whether we want it to fail, give it a description. The category that I've listed here is what you see when we go through here, and if I go into, these are the categories that we've got. So I've got authentication as a category, which then is just a way to group up some of these actions in so that they really can appear as almost different services under the same service connector. And you want to do it that way rather than having lots of different service connectors, each to different variations of resources within Edge. It's much better to have one service connector that deals with all of the different types of interaction with the Edge API. So I've got my login, and if I look at the binding section, you see we paste in the URL. Now this URL could be dynamic. So for example, if I have a connection property that I want to use, I can pass that through. I think we have an example of one of those actually. Yeah. So in the get account by ID, we actually have a parameter for the ID that we need to pass through because this is a get. Whereas if we were doing a post, which we're doing for the login, we don't need that to be dynamic. So that's the URL. And then we can start defining the different types of parameters that we want to send through to this. Now in the login, Edge is pretty simple. We've got a username and password being passed through, nothing particularly complex there. And it's a post. And no inputs because we're getting all of that from our connection properties in this case. And the outputs are us passing the response back from the authorization service. So the auth token, org ID, success message, and status code. As a best practice, we always put the HTTP response status code, and you'll want to put attributes in here to handle fault and success scenarios. So if you get a particular node back in your response that only appears when you have a fault, you want to make sure that that's captured in here so that we can pass it in the event that there is an issue. So I'm going to just do a test here, and when I do the test, you can see here that it's used in, by the way, in the test with section. This is the parameter details that it's using, and it's called the API, the auth endpoint, got back the auth token, and this table here is us passing, the response in the data types that you've listed in the output section. So if you don't see a value in here, it's because you haven't defined the passing of that property correctly. Normally you can just do a straight, if it's a uniquely named property, just select property and just give the name, and that will be enough to retrieve it from the response payload. If you want to do something a bit more sophisticated, you can use XQuery expressions, and I'll show you how we're using those in the DAS and the Dynamics APIs, Service Connector, sorry. Also, you can do things like grab the entire response, or simplify the XML, so remove all the namespaces and various different additional decorators. Okay, so we've done the test. We've got success equals true. We can see the response payload that came back. We can see what we sent to it. Now, even when you're sending a JSON-based request, you'll notice that we've got XML in here, and that's all. Don't worry about that. That's just the way that we comply with BPL standards in this. So it's a fully compliant BPL compliant BPM engine under the hood here, and as a result, what we do is we encapsulate the raw JSON-based request into this standard that we use under the hood. So this is actually the bit that was sent, the payload, and then we can see the full REST response that came back, again encapsulated in some compliance here, but you can see we've got this success JSON array here that's coming back. So use this section here, this test results section, to really work with the API as you're configuring the service connector, and adapt your output properties based on what you're seeing come back. So the other thing I want to point out here is we've got a number of different calls, and we want to actually inherit most of the properties and repeatedly use them in these calls. So once we've done the login, we're going to get these auth tokens back, and whenever I do another call, I want to make sure that we reuse the auth token as a parameter, and I don't want to define that for every single action. So as a result, I have the ability to define an abstract action. All you do is you name the action, and you just select the action type as abstract, and I can say, well, I want a token as a parameter each time, and I've got the ability to define a test with here. And actually, while I'm on that, I'm going to take the result of my token here, and then I'm going to paste that into our base call as a test parameter, so that we can run a test call on this in a bit. So my binding is, in this case, is my base URL that I want to constantly inherit from. I shouldn't need to define that in lots of different places. I want to define that once and then reuse. And then I've got my auth token HTTP header that needs to be sent through for every call. No base level outputs, and I also can't run a test of this because it's actually just an abstract definition. It's not a real actionable API call. So then all I do in the get account by ID or get property by ID is I actually just inherit from base authenticated get. And that means that in the input section, these are grayed out. They're automatically assigned as inherited parameters, and I have the ability to here say, do I want to exclude this from a particular call? Do I want to overwrite it with a particular constant? So I could just manually put in a constant there, or just inherit it. And then I've added to this by saying, well, this particular call needs an ID, and that's going to be explicitly defined here. And then in the bindings section, I have extended the base binding, and then put in this dynamically built URL for this resource. Again, I've just got this from the documentation, where we knew that we could make a call out to retrieve a particular API, and how we needed to call that particular REST resource. And then I've got my auth token grayed out there and inheriting that. And then I've got my outputs, which are specific to this action. And you'll see also here that I'm primarily using properties, but we also have an example of an XQuery statement here where I want to traverse the response that comes back to get a specific parameter. You can find out the XQuery that you need to use here very easily online. The other thing I recommend is something called Zorba. They've actually got an online XQuery editor. And so in this, you can actually just declare your XQuery here and then quickly execute this to see the results. We will, in the near future, be actually building out and exposing full XQuery editing and validation within the environment. So look out for that in the near future. But for the meantime, I would just recommend that you use a tool like Zorba. So let me just run that test. So now we've got the auth token, I've updated that, and I just run this test. It's going to use that and then retrieve this. And this is exactly how we were using the same service call in the guide to retrieve Robert's details and pass that into the SQL Server. And you can see we've dynamically built out the API request based on the ID. We've got the response payload, which in this case is actually XML that's coming back. And we've passed the XML out to get this response table. So that's Edge. Let me just quickly show you the same principles within DAS. DAS, we have a number of different connection parameters. Pretty self-explanatory. We've got the same thing. We've got a login call, which if you look at the binding is calling the DAS authentication service. Now the difference here is we had a requirement to actually build out what was currently a hand-coded authentication code that was being issued, and it was built in .NET using C#. And we needed to replicate that same functionality here. Now, the good thing is here we don't need any code. We can actually do this all through configuration. So if you go into the binding section and click Show Advanced, you'll see in here that we've got a very simple XQuery statement, and all that does is calculate the Unix timestamp. And the reason we're doing that is because the signature is actually comprised of an SHA 256 signed base64 encoded authentication code, which we're signing with this secret key. And the string that we need to sign this key is actually the access key concatenated with a dash and the Unix timestamp. And there was a very specific Unix timestamp that we needed, which is why we've got this expression in here. I actually had never put together that particular authentication route before or process, so it was very easy to do. Just in the documentation online, I was able to find just the information about how to pass the date time to get the Unix timestamp, and then I just passed that through here and signed it using 256 and base64. And then we also have another set of parameters such as the username and application ID that need to be passed through. But again, those are coming through the connection parameters that we've got listed here. So again, once we've done the login, we get an output of this DAS token, issue time, and expiry. Let's run that test so we can see. takes a little bit longer than Edge. And we've got our token back, and I can now use this in my abstract in my input section. I pass that into our test with section. And again, same concept, we have an abstract base authenticated request. The binding is the base level URL. We have our base level parameters that are going to be sent in each case, a content type, basic JSON binding. I'll show you what the other binding types are when we go through the Dynamics service connector. And then in the outputs, we don't need anything in the base, and we're not going to run a test on this. So then we go to the search company ID, and we inherit from the base authenticated request. And I'm just going to execute on that. And again, it's gone through and looking at the binding that we were pretty much inheriting everything, I think, from there. It's automatically created the response that's needed, the request that's needed, and got back this response. Now, I should have shown you actually in this login request in the test results. You'll see here that this key that I mentioned in the REST request, this is the key. This is the key string that we're creating, and that's the bit that actually gets signed. This is the base64 encoded and signed key that gets passed through. Once this is set up, I mean, it's all very straightforward to add additional actions. So we're providing all of this to you, so you'll have this inside your org. So you won't have to repeat these activities. These are one-off setup steps that we've actually done for you. So, and the same goes for the final service connector that I want to go through here. And I appreciate there's a lot of information here, so I promise once we get through this last bit, we are done. So we've got the dynamic service connector created. Same underlying concept. We've got a name. We define the connection parameters, which we found through looking at the Dynamics documentation. In the actions section, we have a login. In the binding of the login, we've got this is the Microsoft Online login service, which we need to authenticate against. And this was just picked up by looking at the documentation that's available for Microsoft Online. And you can see here we've got a number of different parameters. In actual fact, these ones don't need to be dynamic, so they're just to uniquely identify a particular message. But we've put all of this together for you, so you won't need to do this again. And don't worry about the details too much here. We've kind of done the hard work of figuring out what this needs. But what you do need to pay attention to is in this advanced editor section here, we've selected a binding type of custom. Now this will be true whenever you're connecting to a SOAP-based API. With SOAP, the big difference between JSON and SOAP in our environment here is that SOAP has a lot more flexibility. So in JSON, you've got pretty much your key value pairs and you've got a JSON array, so we can automatically pass and work with the bindings. Whereas in SOAP, you can have custom namespaces, you can decide to put your information in an attribute as opposed to in the data section of the node. So because of that flexibility, we allow you the ability to actually paste in an entire request. Let me just format that a little bit better here. Let me just make that a little bit nicer to look at. So you can see here, if I just expand that out, the different information that we've got. And what we've done is we've just swapped out the information that we found from the WSDL and we've swapped that out for the different parameters such as created date, expired date, and any of the other dynamic parameters that we want to send through, such as the password. And the syntax for that is all included in the documentation, but it's just open curly bracket, dollar, variable name, and then close curly bracket, and you'll see that used consistently throughout the solution. So that's how we define what we're actually going to send to this service. So let's just do a test this login. So I just do a test. It comes up very quickly, this particular service, and the auth response here you can see is we get 2 encrypted cipher values back. Again, don't worry about this, it's all been done up front for you, so you can reuse this pre-built connector now, and we retrieve that and then we use it in our base authenticated post. So if I just go back and same underlying idea, we copy that into the authenticated post in the input section, into our test with section, and then I can then use that in our let's say for example our retrieve or our create action. So you'll see we've inherited from this, and let me just look at this base authenticated post. We've got the auth info that needs to be sent through, in the various different attributes that need to be sent through in the header. It's quite specific actually, this. So when, for example, we go through and create an account, we're actually passing through an entire header through, which again has been done for you, so you don't really need to worry about that now. What you can do is just inherit from this and copy these to add additional service calls. So I added in this create account here just by inheriting from the base, and when I did that, I overwrite in the advanced editor, and I just paste in my my SOAP payload to do a creation step. So I've got these key value pairs of an account name, a city, a phone number, so I can just add in additional sections to this if I want to expand out what we're able to send. And I think you'll find if you go through this, you'll see it's actually to add additional actions. If you just look at the WSDL, find the request you need to send, we can actually then just paste that in here and execute. Very straightforward to do that. So if I just click test, it's going to use that session, and it's created my account ID, and you can see here the full response payload that's coming back from Dynamics. Questions, but hopefully through this presentation you can see how flexible the platform is, and you also can see that we've gone through each of these different success criteria, and we're able to deal with your use cases very comprehensively. Thanks very much, and look forward to speaking to you in the next session.